Hey everyone, today I'm continuing our sermon series where we're looking at some different stories of obedience in the Bible. Obedience is a kind of a funny thing. I think often as Christians the issue can be not that we don't know what to do, but that often we won't do what we know to do. And they're kind of subtly different things. Often the question that we have is a question of will we be obedient to what Jesus says to do or not? And that's a real heart issue that we have to wrestle with day in and day out. And so we're just looking at some different stories in the Bible, different stories of obedience, and just seeing what we can learn from them. Today we're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to be looking at the story of Jesus walking on the water, but specifically, actually, that for a while at least, Peter walked on the water. Now this story takes place just after Jesus has fed the 5,000, and so all that's been going on, there's been this outrageous, amazing miracle, and then Jesus kind of dismisses the crowd and he tells the disciples to get in a boat and go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus takes himself off to a mountain to go and by himself to go and pray for a bit. And so that's like the context of what's just happened. We don't know exactly the time, but Jesus has dismissed people, and so you could imagine it's around kind of 7 p.m. in the evening when the disciples set off in their boats. And then we read this story in Matthew 14 verses 22 to 33. It says this: so as soon as the meal was finished, he insisted that the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the people. With the crowd dispersed, he climbed the mountain so he could be by himself and pray. He stayed there alone late into the night. Meanwhile, the boat was far out to sea when the wind came against them and they were battered by the waves. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. They were scared to death. "A ghost," they said, crying out in terror. But Jesus was quick to comfort them. "Courage, it's me, don't be afraid." Peter, suddenly bold, said, "Master, if it's really you, call to me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come ahead." Jumping out of the boat, Peter walked on the water to Jesus. But when he looked down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and started to sink, and he cried, "Master, save me." And Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed his hand. Then he said, "Faint heart, what got into you?" The two of them climbed into the boat and the wind died down, and the disciples in the boat, having watched the whole thing, worshipped Jesus, saying, "This is it, you are God's Son for sure." Now this is just an amazing story, but I think it does us good sometimes to really take some time to try and imagine what's going on. So the disciples in the boat. Now some of these disciples are fishermen. Okay, so some of these disciples are used to being on a boat in a storm. Okay, it's not that they didn't know what they were doing. These are guys who are hardened fishermen who probably fished and sailed through countless storms before. And so to be in a storm wasn't a big deal, but clearly they'd been in a storm at this point for so long in the story we're reading that it's got to the point where there's nothing more they can do. Like they feel like they're facing death now. It feels like they're stuck and they're just waiting for that moment when they're going to be capsized or overwhelmed by waves and die. And it's about 4 in the morning. And so it could have been that they've been in this boat for 8 or 9 hours. It could have been they've been in the storm for that period of time. That's a long time to be in a storm, like up and down and tossed by the waves and things like that. I remember when I was 17, I went on a youth kind of weekend thing on a boat, and we yachted across to Holland, across the sea and then back again. And it didn't start well because I was seasick on the Thames when it was as flat as anything, which didn't bode well for the rest of the journey. But when we were coming back from Holland, as we were coming out of the canals, before us stood the sea. And there was just storm clouds and rain, and the sea was all churned up like this. And we were kind of like, surely we're not going to go that way. And yet we were, because that was the way home. And what followed was 12 hours of like violent seasickness, like the green stuff down in the pit of your stomach coming up, and just waves going up and down. At one point the sail got caught in the wrong place and the boat completely pitched on its side. I mean, it was terrifying, it was awful. Even the crew, who were used to sailing and stuff like that, they looked worried. Nothing about it was good. Okay, well, that's kind of what's going on here. Like these are people who know what they're doing, but they've got to a point where they're fearful for their lives as they're caught in this storm in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And so that's kind of what's going on, and they're pretty weak, and they're probably tired, and they're wet, and they're cold, and they must have been sick, and up and down. And then suddenly, what do they see? Like they see something walking towards them. And so they're kind of in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and yet not that far away, something's coming towards them on the sea, and maybe they lose sight of it as the kind of the horizon goes up and down, as the waves are moving, and so they see something, and there are waves in the way, and then they see something again, and they're fearful. They think it's a ghost. Maybe they think this is death come to get them, and it's Jesus walking on the water, and like, hey, that's a miracle in itself. Okay, I don't know if you ever tried walking on water. Every time I go to a swimming pool or to the seaside, I always have that moment when my foot hovers over the water, and I just think, well, maybe this time. And then I put my foot down, and sure enough, it goes straight through the water. Now, maybe it's because I try and do that from the shallow end and not the deep end. Maybe that's a measure of my faith. I should try walking off the deep end and seeing what happens. I mean, could you imagine that? How crazy would that be if suddenly you're walking on the water? I don't quite know what people would think. I don't know how the lifeguards would react, blowing their whistles, no walking on the water. Like, it's not a thing we see every day, and yet here's Jesus walking on the water, deep water, stormy water, towards the boat. And so they're fearful because they don't know who it is, they don't know what's going on. And Jesus cries out, "No, it's me, don't worry, I'm coming, it's me." And Peter then says, suddenly emboldened, it's amazing how just the glimpse of Jesus, just a view of Jesus, just Jesus coming into our perspective and our view can completely change our heart. So Peter was in the boat, fearful, looked like death was going to happen, weak, wet, like without hope. And then just Jesus coming into the picture, suddenly it gives him hope. It gives him confidence. And so he says, "Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water to you." Now just think about that for a second. I mean, that's not a normal request. Okay, I don't know if that's the sort of thing that you think, it's the sort of thing I do. I don't know, it's the sort of thing that I would do. It's not a normal request. Peter says, if it's you, tell me to come out there with you on the water in the middle of the storm. You tell me to come, and I'll come. And so then Jesus says, "Yeah, it's me, Peter, come." Now, I don't know. So Peter's got his choice now. Is Peter going to be obedient or not? And he's in a weird position because now Jesus has invited him, commanded him to step out of a boat which hadn't sunk yet onto the stormy sea, like in the middle of the lake. And what should normally happen is that he should do that and then straight into the water and probably drown in the middle of a storm. And so Peter prepares to get out of the boat. And have you ever thought about this? So this boat's in a storm, so it's not just a still boat like that Peter just steps out of. This boat is going up and down and being tossed by the waves and waves crashing over it. So how do you get out of a boat in that context? What does it look like? I mean, does Peter just jump over, like grabs his legs and jumps and just lands hard on the water but doesn't sink? Or does he just wait on the edge of the boat as it goes up and down, and just as it kind of goes down, just steps off at the opportune moment? I mean, I don't know. But one way or the other, Peter gets out of the boat and doesn't sink. And Lord knows what the rest of the disciples are thinking as they see this. I mean, they're all still in the boat, cowering. Peter's the only one got off, and they see Peter get off, and what's he doing? And then he doesn't sink. What's going on? And Peter's there as he obedient to Jesus, standing on the water, and then begins to walk towards Jesus. We don't have an idea of how long this was. I mean, maybe it's only a few seconds, but I mean, I don't know how far away Jesus was. It must have been a little way away. And does Peter just start walking straight towards Jesus? Does Peter, is it 1 minute? Is it 2 minutes? Is it 3? I don't know. But he's on the water in a storm, I don't know what it like walking on the water. In my mind, when I picture it, I'm always thinking, well, you're walking on flat water like that, because that's just where my mind pictures it. But actually, he's in a storm going up and down. So, what does he do? Does he rise and fall with the waves as he's walking, or do the waves kind of just come over his legs and go back down? I don't know. He's standing on top of the water in a storm, up and down. Just like, it's difficult to get our heads around. I think that's crazy. And yet, what happened? Peter said to Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come, even though it makes no sense. And Jesus says to him, yeah, come. And what is Peter? Peter's obedient. Even though it makes no sense, Peter is obedient. And a miracle happens. And he's walking on the water. And he's walking towards Jesus. And for a while, everything's going great. I mean, this is amazing. This is a miracle. Everything's going great. He's walking. And then, suddenly, I don't know, Peter becomes aware of what's going on. He starts taking his eyes off Jesus and starts looking at the storm and starts looking at the waves and starts looking where he's standing, and his faith wavers and he begins to sink. And I don't know, what does that look like? Does he start to sink slowly? As each step he takes, he just gets lower and lower in the water. I mean, how low does he go before Jesus comes and rescues him? Does it come up to his knees? Does it come up to his waist? Does it come up to his chest? Where does he get to in the water before Jesus comes to save him? I don't know. Does he stand still and just begin to sink? Does he sink quickly? I don't know. But he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sink, and he cries out, "Jesus, save me!" And it says that Jesus immediately went to save him. I mean, this is the character of Jesus. Yeah, I mean, that we have got a God, that we have got a King who is on the front foot, passionate to rescue, passionate to save, passionate to come into the midst of our mess, in the midst of our fear, in the midst of what's going on our lives, and reach out his hand and rescue. That's what he does to Peter, and that's a great picture of what he's done to me and continues to do to me, and what he wants to do to like thousands and thousands of people in our town. That he would want to come, and as they cry out, "Jesus, help me!" It's exactly what he wants to do. And so Jesus gets to Peter, takes him by the hand, and I guess Peter then emerges from the water. I don't know. And then together, hand in hand, Jesus goes back to the boat with Peter, and they climb in the boat. Again, what's the logistics of getting back in a boat that's going up and down in the storm? Do you wait for it to dip and then jump in? Do you grab hold of the thing that's going up and down and clamber over? Is someone pulling you? I don't know. Like, it's not a neat, clean story that we can imagine, actually. It's messy in the midst of all this sort of thing. And then Jesus says to Peter, he says, "Faint heart, what got into you? What got into you?" They get back in the boat, and the storm dies down, for the miracle. And all the disciples are just utterly amazed. I mean, they're on the floor, they're amazed, they're flabbergasted. Surely, we know you are the Son of God. I mean, how can you see that and not believe it? You've walked on the water, Peter's been on the water, you've calmed the storm, you've saved our life, surely. I mean, they're just overawed. And so this story, I think sometimes we can read the story, and actually there is an element for it of asking the question, well, Jesus asked the question, "Oh, Peter, what happened to your faith? You're doing so well, and then you took your eyes off me." But I think also if we're not careful, we can do Peter a disservice. For a while, at least, Peter walked on the water with Jesus. For a while, at least, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a lake, Peter was walking on the water. None of the rest of the disciples were, but Peter was. Peter in this story shows, I mean, eventually he takes his eyes off Jesus, but initially, what does he do? He takes a giant step of obedience into something that doesn't make a lot of sense, to be honest. I mean, what should happen when you stand on water is you sink. Okay, Peter knows that. And yet for a while he's walking on the water, and so what does he do? He takes this giant step of obedience into something that doesn't make sense, but because Jesus has said do it, he does it by faith. And Jesus meets him there in his faith. So, I think we can read this sometimes and think, oh, it's a story of Peter's failure on the water. Yeah, maybe. Or we can look and see it's a story of Peter's obedience. And yes, in the end, he struggled and Jesus rescued him. But what a step of obedience to take. What an example to us all. And so I'm going to just leave you with 3 questions. This story teaches us lots of things. And so firstly, it teaches us to look for Jesus and keep looking to Jesus. Okay, so although the storm surrounded him, what did Peter do? Peter looked to Jesus. The only problem in the end was that Peter stopped looking to Jesus. And the principle's clear, especially when life is a big outrageous storm, and life often feels like that, I think. It feels like we're in the middle of a storm quite a lot of times. Well, when life is feeling like that, like all the time, but when life is in a storm as well, look for Jesus and keep looking to Jesus. It's so easy to get our eyes taken off of Jesus. It's so easy to look for other answers and other alternatives. It's so easy to, lose heart and lose faith. In the midst of life, whether good times or stormy times, keep looking to Jesus. And so here's a question: what does looking to Jesus look like for you? What does looking to Jesus look like for you? Secondly, when Jesus commands you, obey him. So Jesus told Peter to come to him on the water. And even though that made no sense whatsoever, Peter did what Jesus said. This is what obedience looks like, doing what Jesus says. Okay, it's what obedience is. What is obedience? Jesus tells me to do something, I do it. That's obedience. That's what it is to be a disciple, a follower of Jesus, is that we have given our lives to him and I will do what he tells me to do. And so here's another question for you maybe to consider. Is there any area in your life that you're not obeying the Lord? Is there any area in your life that you're not obeying the Lord? And the last thing just to put out of this is that faith is simply taking the next step. I think we build faith up sometimes. I've got to have faith. Well, faith works out in taking the next step. Peter took one step to get out of the boat. Maybe he jumped whatever, but he took a step to get out of the boat and onto the water. And Peter was doing just fine when his eyes were fixed on Jesus and he was focused on just take the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and the next step. But he got into trouble when he lost sight of his next step. Here's Jesus, I'll just keep going, I'll keep being obedient. And then suddenly the storm caught his attention. And he was no longer focused on Jesus and taking the next step with Jesus, but suddenly he began to get into trouble. Faith is simply taking the next step. And so here is the last question for you to consider. What next step has Jesus asked you to take on your journey with him? What next step is Jesus asking you to take on the journey with him? And how will you respond? Let me pray for you and then we'll finish. Jesus, I love stories of obedience, and in this story I love Peter, crazy Peter, jumping out of a boat because you told him to come to you on the water. And it's like a mind-blowing story to read, and a scary story to read, but Lord, I want to be like that. I want to be someone who's obedient like Peter was obedient. I want to be someone who comes when you tell me to come. And I pray for us, Lord, would you help us? Would you help us to look for you and to look to you as we live our lives? I pray, would you help us to have hearts that want to be obedient? And obedience is a wrestling we have each day. Will today I be obedient to God? Holy Spirit, thank you that you help us. And I pray, help me this day to live a life of obedience to you, that I would do what you tell me to do. And Jesus, I pray, help me to take the next step with you. even now, if some of us are thinking, well, I know what the next step is, I just haven't taken it yet. Lord, I pray, would you help? I pray, Holy Spirit, would you help us take the next step on our journey with you? And then the one after that, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, keeping you fixed before us, Jesus. Not being distracted by all the different things of the storm and the things of life, but looking for you and looking to you. And thank you that you take the step with us. Thank you that in this story, as Peter got into trouble, what happened? You came instantly and immediately to help him, and then walked with him. And thank you, Jesus. I know that as we live a life for you, you are walking with us. And so help us, I pray, to live lives that bring you glory, live lives of obedience that declare that we love you and that you are our Lord, and they make much of you, Jesus. Amen. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.